All right. It is so good to be with you today, Malcolm Collins. I'm going to borrow your opening
Yeah.
line from your videos.
Oh, hello, it is wonderful to be here with you today.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome to Honey Badger Arcade. And my name is Brian, in case you guys don't know. And I'm here with Malcolm Collins, the half of the Based Camp team. You make videos with your wife and you talk about all kinds of different things that interest you, from the cultural to the social to the political, and even a lot of philosophical topics. So I thought you'd be a good fit as one of the guests to talk
Yeah,
about.
I'm happy to jump in and be talking about any area that is interesting to you. We're at a really cool point in cultural and civilizational history right now because we're seeing simultaneously the collapse of a global cultural, like dominant cultural faction. The urban monoculture that we've talked about, that some people identify as like wokeism or leftism or whatever, has definitely, like, the tide has broken against it in this past year, and it is beginning to lose a lot of ground in what people are calling the vibe shift. To be able to live through, and the urban monoculture was probably the largest civilizational spanning empire humanity has ever seen in this globalized community. And to see it not just collapse, but collapse so soon after gaining dominance, just maybe held dominance for a span of 15 years. So that's been fascinating. At the same time, as we see the rise of AI and collapse in fertility rates, both of which change everything about what it means to compete civilizationally.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot that's already there. You're dropping some heavy stuff on us right off the bat, but let's back up a little bit. I definitely want to get into that. Just realized it was something that was on my mind today. Just now you reminded me of it. We are in June, but the whole like pride thing, not really seeing it that much.
Yeah.
It's very subdued this year. I don't know if you noticed, in particular with in the online space, like social media space, for example, on X, which I was looking at briefly, none of the big corporations are putting rainbows on everything. They're all like taking a step back. There are some like little nods, but it doesn't seem to be as prominent. Do you think that's part of what we're calling the vibe shift?
Oh no, it's 100% downstream of the vibe shift. And I think that the whole pride phenomenon is really interesting to me because it is so transparently just the whitewashing of white pride. They're literally like, what are they celebrating if not a European culture? Like, this is not Latin American culture. This is not African culture. This is not Asian culture. This is a modified form of European culture, and they are celebrating its victory over other cultural backgrounds as they hold these triumphs in major cities or historically. And it worked really well for people because people had been told, oh, you're not allowed to have pride in your heritage anymore. You're not allowed to have pride in your religion anymore. You're not allowed to have pride in your nation anymore. These things are all seen as like sinful or dangerous now. So if you can't have pride in any historic related aspect of your identity, let's give you this other thing you can have pride on. The things that cause arousal in you. That can be your core source of pride and then your core source of identity. And that is where all of this came from.
That's an interesting take on that. What do you think? One of the things that I'm seeing, because one of the things I want to talk about is this concept of the woke right, and in particular with its involvement with Gamergate. In case you don't know, I've been involved in Gamergate since before Gamergate started, and this is like 2013 or so, when I saw, because I was actually an aspiring comic book artist, and I saw that what was happening within the comic book industry, where a lot of these sort of like progressive adjustments were being made and canon was being altered, and I had a lot of criticisms and questions about it. But I was there for the original Gamergate when it really blew up, 2014, 2015. And what ended up happening was around 2016, 2017, Gamergate ate itself. And I'm not saying that it ever really ended, because a lot of people say that what's going on with recently with Sweet Baby Inc. and their involvement in gaming and all this other stuff is like a Gamergate 2, Cabrutus Rambo's Steam list page being attacked by Chris Kindred, etc. I think it's just a continuation. But one of the things that I've noticed that happens in these, let's say, consumer revolts or these conversations is you start off and everybody's on the same page and they're all like, we're going to push back on this kind of woke scolding that's happening. And then when they start to pick up ground, you get purity testing that happens from within, right? So some people say, oh, this is where I think this comes from. This is what I want to see the end result to be. And then there's the other side of that. So, for example, in the first Gamergate, the divide was between whether or not the issue was simply addressing the ethics questions in journalism, or if it was the ideology that created the problem to begin with that has to be addressed, which at the time was feminism. And the people who wanted the ethics thing dealt with, they won out. So what ended up happening, in my opinion, was a temporary victory, because they got some people made some changes and some people got fired. But the feminist ideology just kept ramping up and ramping up. And now we're at this stage. And I think that's happening again right now.
Yeah. There's two areas I want to dig in here. The first area I want to dig in is the most recent extension of Gamergate. Have you followed much of the sort of VTuber gate and the Kirsche? I thought that this was really fascinating because it, to me, showed how far things have moved, and that this journalist attempted to basically libel this VTuber and get her fired. And she did get one of the brands to pull out of working with Kirsche, but the community so quickly and so loudly clapped back on her and the Vice article she had written that it was just clear that she lost. Like, public sentiment was against her. And
you mean Anna Valens?
Anna Valens, yeah. And Kirsche ended up in a better position because of this particular controversy. She's been doing the victory lap on all the shows and everything. And this, to me, demonstrated how hard it's going to be institutionally for the leftists to clamp back power, ironically, because of Blue Sky. Blue Sky has done much more to defang the left mob than the Twitter acquisition did, because at least they were still on Twitter, right? Like, they may not have had dominance of the mods, but at least they were still on it. When Blue Sky came about, which has about 1% of the daily volume of Twitter, the people who made stories like this go viral, who would protect somebody like Anna Valens in front of people with different perspectives, left. And so they've become very isolated. And if they can't get back, and now nobody reads the newspapers anymore, or at least very few people do, right? So they don't really have the institutional power that they had historically to push. But we on the right also have to worry about, does what we are building here break apart? And what some individuals have done, famously James Lindsay, I think, is the one who's pushing this the most, is this concept of the woke right. And then on the other side of this discussion, you have individuals like Sargon of Akkad, who's quite against the concept of the woke right. And when I first heard the concept of the woke, I liked the idea, because I was like, we do want to make sure we don't go too far in the other direction. But then I realized that it was just concern policing in the same way the left does. And that's not a position we want to be in. And recently we have a video on this on our channel. Actually, we developed like a much larger, because the Heritage Foundation, which I work with all the time, I really like them as people, but they did it that basically explicitly called Simone and I out as being faces of pronatalism, and that we shouldn't be, and that we shouldn't even be. And I was like, okay, specifically, they don't like our IVF practices and stuff like that. They called us out on all this. And the thing I realized in response is, this is the one thing that we need to worry about on the right, which is not police other people's beliefs or values, but police anyone who's attempting to break up the alliance, which is making the right work right now, like the tech right MAGA partnership or New Right partnership. And the reason why this partnership has worked so well, and I pointed this out in our rebuttal to Heritage, is everything that could realistically be passed within today's legislature, we have overlap on. We want more restricted access to abortion. They want more restricted access to abortion. We don't want this gender ideology stuff being pushed down our kids' throats. They don't want the gender ideology stuff being pushed down our kids' throats. Yeah, if one of us had absolute power, there's other things we would want. They might want a ban on IVF. They might want a ban on all abortions. They might want restrictions on gay marriage, but none of those things could win in an American election cycle if you look at current polling data. And we might want things that they wouldn't want, government research into artificial wombs and stuff like that. But that's also not going to win. So in every area where we can actually win, like it makes sense for us to collaborate. And we want a thriving America, they want a thriving America, right? So everywhere where we can actually win, it makes sense to collaborate. So the one thing we really have to worry about is anyone on the right who says, okay, people with these views, they're not allowed in this coalition. Because that's
it's like they end up sabotaging what is otherwise a very strong coalition.
Yeah.
Because again, they go down this, it's purity spiral. It's like, the reason why I think it's really cool that you brought up Kirsha, because I brought her up too. I've been following Kirsha for a very long time. And the thing about it is that what I'm seeing in the Gamergate space, and I think it extends, you know who actually, I know that James Lindsay coined the term, but the person who started going down that road was actually Dan Crenshaw. He was one of the first adopters. And if for a while I liked him, and then I realized he was a war hawk and a neocon. And the neocons are the kind of people that I think that most of the side of tech right and the MAGA base types don't want. They don't want wasteful wars. They're generally on that side of things. And I think it came out of there, but I think that the meaning of the term woke rights shifted. It's a little bit amorphous because sometimes it applies to people like Sargon, who I think that he's, for most of the time that I've known him, he's been a liberal, but for the most part, just like me. And I think that in a lot of ways he still is, but he's just become a little bit more grounded in like, what are the realistic aspects of liberalism that are not too pie in the sky? What are the things that it can actually accomplish? What are the things that are reasonable, that are like backed by wisdom or whatever? But what I'm seeing with Kirsha that I thought was really interesting was there's been a little bit of infighting with some sort of like hardcore Catholics that are in Gamergate. Jonathan Trent, who writes for Fandom Pulse, and John Delarose, for example. And they went on Smash JT, or they had a big debate with him or a fight with him over some stuff. And you have this infighting going on. And their reasoning is that they want to get the sort of progressive politics out of these cultural spaces because they're like writers. So it's in literature, it's in television, it's in everything. But they also want to remove what they consider to be degeneracy. And that's a very gray area because if something has sex appeal, they don't like it. So you run into a lot of like this purity that goes on where they're trying to get rid of everything. And when the Kirsha thing broke, I said, I remember I did it on my show. I said, Kirsha's done more positive research that's been helpful to us. She looked into Bridge and BlackRock and Vanguard and all of these corporatist practices and all of the ways that these kind of like DEI policies are going into hiding. They're not really going away. They're just being rebranded and renamed and then reinstituted. I even think that's still going on in colleges, even though Trump said some things about it. But at the end of the day, he can't really force anything. He can just. But then I said, she's doing all this work, but she's a VTuber. So is that degenerate? Is she not qualified anymore? Because I think VTubing, I wouldn't call it that, but there's definitely let's say, a sexual component or potentially sexual component usually to that kind of thing. So
yeah, I really want to pull on two chains that you brought up here, right?
Yeah.
If I can. So the first one is to continue with what we were talking about before. We do on the right, though, need to be aware that we have our own version of trans advocacy, which is just like crazy people who do nothing but hurt us in election cycles. And what's been really great is we don't need to. The right's version of that type of individual has self-selected themselves out of the right. One of the things I always point up is before the last election cycle, a number of people of this category told their followers to vote against Trump. Here I'm thinking Nick Fuentes very actively said anyone who follows him should be voting against Trump. Leather Apron Club said this. Anyone who follows him should be voting against Trump. David Duke said this. Richard Spencer said this. Pretty much all of the racialized part of the right, which I don't think should be on the right at all. Like,
I don't think it is on the right, but
it's
we can
not
get
really,
into that too. Yeah.
But they identified, right? Like in a lot of the
Yeah.
left tried to identify. They self-selected and self-isolated as MAGA took its new, more pluralistic turn. And so we don't need to actively, you can just have this faction. So the trans advocates, the left doesn't even need to turn on them. It just needs to stop capitulating for them and they'll run out of the room screeching. Like they'll handle their own self-isolation as long as everyone else is being reasonable. But to the second part, the degen part. So degen has become a core aspect of the new, and it has been since its inception. Tracer butt controversy, Skullgirls controversy. If you've been covering this stuff, the pro-degen has always been the right. The anti-degen has always been the left. And what we're seeing here is this is another faction. I wouldn't call this faction woke or anything like that. I call them like the pearl clutchers. And the pearl clutchers rose during a time when the, Judeo-Christian value system was the dominant value system in the United States and in their countries. And they were able to use their political apparatus and party to enforce that value system on the population. But they are not the dominant cultural system anymore. The urban progressives are, the urban monoculture is, and they are now using the government to force their culture on other people. So if you have Christian values or Catholic values or whatever, and you want to protect those values, you need to work to ensure that no one can enforce their culture on other people, not to enforce your culture, because you're just not going to win if that's what you're attempting to do. And we've seen, like, if you look at Man's World, a raw nationalist thing, it's like anime girls on the front, like big titty anime girls. Leaning in to male sexuality has been a big part of the aesthetics of the new right, leaning into anime as well, because anime is produced in a country that's not as affected by wokeism in media. So you can get media that is less, and to ask, why did the right go in to this ultra vitalistic, ultra sexualized media? It's been a reaction to what the left did. So if you go back to the 80s and the 90s, the right tried to enforce cultural uniformity through disgust. It would be like, hey, like two men kissing, that grosses you out, so it's bad, right? And then society grew up from that, and you had, what is it, like Mother Teresa, like hugging lepers and everything. And it's, hey, you're like, just because you feel disgusted by something doesn't mean you should shun it. It's not a sign that thing is like morally failed. We should build like more sophisticated moral systems in that. But while the right used disgust for this, the counterculture, which at the time was left, now the counterculture is predominantly right, in its art, started to go intentionally into ugliness as a sign of moral virtue. One of my favorite things from the director of Starship Troopers is he was like, I'm so surprised that people couldn't see that the Federation was meant to be the bad guy. I made them all attractive white people. And I was like, who looks at like attractive people and assumes they must be the villains? But we see this in video games, this intentional uglification of games, this intentional uglification of art. And the right has moved in and been like, no, let's embrace beauty. Let's embrace vitalism. Let's embrace male sexuality. And this fuddy-duddy part of the right that is used to these old pearl clutching tactics, they're still out there talking, but they're not culturally relevant. They're mostly writing in like publications and working within organizations that came into power during the old regime. But I don't think that they're going to have persistent cultural power in the new regime, because frankly, what they're selling just sucks. I don't view them as a threat. Nobody's not voting because of them or something like that. But they're certainly not going to get a young person excited about being part of the right movement. They're not going to get your person coming over. And I always talk about the right. There's this scene in this cartoon, Madagascar, where they're trying to get him to come to the fun side of the island, where they're having this pretend party and everything like that. And I'm like, that is what the right feels like to me these days. It's people intentionally leaning in to having fun, even where it goes against what's real. We had an episode recently where we divide this using animes. Are you Chinubuing it, or are you what-emoting it? Are you making up a pretend world to an extent because you can choose how you internalize the world around you? Or are you just letting the world as it is crush you? And what a lot of the right does these days within the new right circles is they're like, look, I get to be in a world-spanning fight for human civilization. Like, why don't I lean into that? Did Shinzo Abe, like with a lot of new right art, Shinzo Abe as a central figure, did Shinzo Abe's spirit actually protect Trump from being assassinated? Did it actually protect him from the witches on Reddit? No. But is it cooler to pretend it did? Yes. So we're going to do that. Like, it operates on this rule of cool. And
absolutely.
So that's what I think of individuals like that is, I don't think that they're not threatening to me because what they're selling isn't palatable.
And the thing is too, is that it it has the whiff of the woke scolds too, where it's you're not allowed to like this. And I think that you're right about this leaning into male sexuality or the male senses, because for the longest time, men have been getting shamed for liking attractive women. And then when they push back on that, and then you get like these kind of girl clutchers that come and they're also shaming men for their sexuality. I think that male sexuality in particular is demonized from all sides. And so I say to men, just do you and don't worry about it. And I think that when it comes to, because I mean, I'm a Christian, but the way I see it is that you have to allow people the freedom to choose the good. You can't make them be good, because then it's not moral. It's essentially just force. And then it's no different from like what the left does with their, you're just going to eat the porridge because we said so. You eat your vegetables, your what's the stuff that I hated as a kid? Brussels sprouts. But you got to eat the Brussels sprouts. And I think that if I choose the Brussels sprouts, it's better.
Yes, something I want to touch on something you're saying here, because I find it to be very interesting, and it's something I've noticed that I've seen as a shift within the new right recently. So one reason why a lot of the new right initially started to go into this is what the MAGA movement really was, a shift from a conservative party in the United States that was dominated by the values of cavalier culture, which is an aristocratic culture of the Deep South, to the greater Appalachian or backwoods culture, which is a clan-based anti-aristocratic culture, which is what would be like truck nut conservatives and stuff like that. Or a lot of country music comes from
they were like from Scotland or like Scots-Irish, right? A lot of them, as opposed to English.
Anti-elitist group that they actually see vulgarity as a sign of authenticity, because it's a sign that you are not attempting to submit yourself to the elite's power structure and signaling mechanisms. The problem then is a lot of the right, we did this to begin with, and Man's World did this to begin with. So for example, in their early episodes or magazines, they would publish really old school Playboy stuff. It's like a classy older thing, but also it had nudity. And in our show, we used to, for example, curse on our show, and we stopped doing that because a lot of people watch the show with their kids. And people can be like, wait, so then what do you mean by vulgarity if you're taking out like cursing and nudity? And it's what I guess I'd call wholesome vulgarity. It's vulgarity that subverts the senses of what the elitist leftists want to think is okay, but that isn't actually going to hurt a child or something like that. This is like Elon Musk joking about like making cat girl robots or something like that. This is
on his team named Big Balls.
Yeah, the guy, big balls and stuff like that. It's playful, boyish vulgarity, not the type that actually subverts our cultural values. And so I think that there is some alignment in what we want and what they want. Nobody's going to pass a porn ban in the United States. I think that the weird anime ban thing they did in Texas was incredibly ill-conceived. But I also think that hopefully we start to see the right move past this. And I agree with you 100%. You haven't saved someone from a sin if you do not give them the option or temptation for that sin. And we see in countries where you have more regulations around sin, you often get more sinning overall because people don't build up this internal self-control mechanism.
Yes. So then what do you think about, so we have these games, The First Descendant, it's called The First Descendant. It's like a South Korean game that has, and it uses sex appeal to essentially get people to play. A lot of it's pretty, I'm not offended, but it is obvious what they're doing. So do you think that there is like a line between when games are just supposed to be using sex appeal to market themselves, and when they get into something that's more pornographic? Like, where does the wholesome kind of degeneracy,
so I think sex
where's the
appeal,
line at?
Our world today is completely inundated in things that use sex appeal to attempt to manipulate us. The analogy I often use in regards to this is in regards to degeneracy and stuff like that. I don't know if you ever saw the movie The Abyss.
Oh yeah, it's great. It's a great movie.
You know that
the
scene,
underrated James Cameron film.
Yeah, where they put the mouse in that water stuff, and it has to learn to breathe the liquefied oxygen because it is in an environment that is nothing but water. And the way that we relate to, I think, our own arousal and sexuality it needs to transition as a society. We used to be able to say, Christian world, hey, just avoid the streams, but now our entire society is under 50 feet of water. You've got to learn a different way of relating to this stuff. And the way that I say it, I've learned to do this myself, is to recontextualize arousal as just my body telling me I should be having more kids. Because that's what it is, your body telling you. That's why you have arousal, is so you make babies. It's not like everything else about arousal. You are cucking yourself if you, based on your own arousal, waste your energy and effort to interact with something that's not going to produce babies. There is no difference between using video games to get off and sleeping with a trans woman, right? Like in both cases, it's just masturbation. I'd even say the same for non-reproductive sex more broadly. Like it's just masturbation with additional steps. Where non-reproductive stuff might help with like chemical bonding with the wife and stuff like that. And so I can put it, okay, in this separate category here. But this has helped me a lot be more resistant to the way people are using these signals, and to better contextualize the ways I should be spending my time. And that's my wider thought. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I'm really glad that you made that point about needing to recontextualize, because this is the thing that I've been trying to get people to understand, is that like we, like you say, we live in a world that's inundated with sexual stimulation. It's everywhere. And it is a human thing to have that experience. The question is, how do you deal with it? Not do we take it away? Because that won't work. It's like the war on drugs. Like it's meaningless. But then there must be like in the same way that our world has changed because everything's gone digital, because there's so much access that people have. Whereas maybe before the internet, like Americans didn't really know much about whatever happened in other countries. Now we know way more than we ever probably would have thought to want to learn. And that means that we're also exposed like a nerve to like all the other stimulus, and all the other cultures. They have their own, they have their own value systems and things they're working with. So then what I think is, what I believe is, we live in the world is fallen to some degree. And so that there's nothing that can be done about that. You can't make this world into heaven. You just have to live in it and do your best. And the reason why I want to bring up that first descendant thing is because I think it's a bit annoying that we're nitpicking that, because this is the exact same thing that the woke left does. It's why they uglified everything, which is why I more so see them as a threat, because people on the quote unquote will scold you for having a libido, but people on the left will actually they'll go work in the companies that make the products that you like, and then they'll change everything. So it's like a top-down control, right? It's different from somebody telling you don't buy that thing. It's someone going over there and changing it from the top down by being consultants or whatever. Even though that seems to be potentially on the way out, I've seen some major changes happening, because I think what happens is these feminist groups, they somehow market their ideas to these corporations and convince them that this is what people want. And then corporations, thinking they're going to make a lot of money, they respond to that, and now they're losing money. So they're starting to fire people in all these big studios. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to say, if we go back to Anna Valens, right? The reporter for Vice who tried to attack Kirsche, this is a trans woman. We have an episode of our show where we basically say going into the life of a Cenobite, because they're not just like a normal trans woman. They are somebody who dedicates their entire life to sexuality, arousal, kinks, everything like that.
Would you say, real quick, I'm sorry, would you say that's different from, because I know some trans women, like I know Blair White, for example, is a very popular, prominent trans woman. And I think for some people, it's truly like an issue of gender dysphoria. But I also think there's other reasons. So when you say Cenobite, you're talking about people that say, like Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, who's not trans, but has an autogynephilia. Is it something like that?
As we point out about Anna Valens, like Anna Valens does not hide why they're trans. They write lots of sexual content, and a lot of it is about feminization and forced feminization. Like any trans person who says being trans isn't a kink, for this individual, it very clearly is a kink, because they write a lot of porn about men being forcibly feminized. So I think that like you can say, okay, there's maybe this category of trans where it's not a kink or anything like that. But for this individual, it is. This is an individual who just went into whatever gave them arousal was their life. And the reason we went over her diary was to be like, when you're a young man and you're in these online spaces and everyone's competing about what being masculine or being like the most Christian or being like the most whatever, they're often not thinking about what they're really fighting for as an end state, right? What they're really fighting for as an end state is living that scene from Gladiator, right? You want the family, you want the kids, you want the loving partner, and you want to be happy and supportive of each other. And that's what I have with my daily life right now, where if you just lean into all this arousal stuff, the horror that your life becomes, which is why I use the Cenobite analogy from the old Hellraiser series, because they were like this. There was a dimension of people who just sought out pleasure, and then it ends up all horrified and disfigured and everything like that. The end state of that is genuinely horrifying. It's very easy to see it's horrifying and communicate this to young people. Like, the insane from Gladiator is what you want. This is not what you want. And it's also interesting to me that in Western media, you don't see that end scene in Gladiator anymore. You don't see that being depicted anywhere. It is a cultural memory. You do see it in anime, though. You see it constantly in anime. Like, Grandma and Grandpa turn young again. I talk about frequently, like the end scene in that. But an analogy that I've used on my show, which has helped me recontextualize sexuality, because this doesn't just hurt men, it hurts women.
Of course.
Recently, my wife was telling me she was feeling bad about herself because varicose veins and not looking as young as she once did, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, girl, you're pregnant with kid number 5 right now. All of that beauty was just a sign to get somebody to do this with you. Like, you used that for its intended purpose. And this brings me to this concept that we talk about, which is the fish market idea, which is like all young women are basically given a big fish and they're told to go to the market to sell it because fish are for eating. But they realize at the market that all the freshest, nicest looking fish, like everybody's coming over to look at their fish because they're really looking to determine if that's the fish they want to buy. And what ends up happening is a dominance hierarchy around how big and fresh looking your fish is. And so the girls, they never sell their fish. And so the fish start to rot. And so then they start to taxidermy their fish. And they start to put all sorts of chemicals in their fish so it still looks like a fresh fish. Now, of course, nobody really wants to eat this fish anymore. It's become a mockery of everything that originally made fish desirable to individuals. But that's what our entire society has become. And if you are an individual who is going out there and consuming this sort of like completely artificial fish or completely taxidermied and filled with chemicals fish in this ever desire to look young, you're absorbing that toxicity into yourself, and it's going to affect how you see yourself in the world. The thing I keep trying to bring people back to is, I think for a lot of the times, the way that Christians went about this argument was, don't go and do the fun thing. That's sinful. Don't doing the pleasure-seeking thing because that's not what God wants of you. And I think that now we have a much easier argument we can make, which is, don't do the degen thing or you're going to end up like Anna Valens. You're going to end up hating your life
in terms of Cenobite.
Self-affirmation.
Yeah. And it's actually really interesting because I think you're right. And it's something that I've been trying to, it's hard to talk about because on the one hand, I want to be sympathetic to people who genuinely have gender dysphoria, but it can be very difficult to know the difference between that and someone who, like Anna Valens. And I think that maybe because what I remember speaking to a pretty prominent woman named Erin Pitsey, who opened the very first women's shelter in the 1960s in Chiswick in England. And I did an interview with her and she brought up out of the blue, she said, don't you think it's weird? And we weren't talking about transgenderism at all, but she said, don't you think it's strange that 75% of all people who transition are male to female? And I was like, really? Like, it's that lopsided? Now, since then, that was probably
changed.
It has. More girls are starting to identify as boys, but for a long time it was very lopsided. And I wonder if it isn't because, like you said, there is no great heroic tale for men to pursue, because that's that gladiator thing. I think that men desperately want their own hero's journey, and we don't put that out there at all. And it's like you said, it's like a cultural, feels like a distant memory. And we can have a conversation about why that is. But I do think that there is a number of factors that are contributing to that. And on the girls' side, another thing too, because we do almost, I think, over occupy ourselves shaming men for their sexual interests without taking the time to correctly point that energy, because obviously it's going to be there, but we got to direct it in a direction that's helpful for men.
I was going to say, we see this in certain circles on the right that are mostly downstream of right-leaning culture in the UK, which is really different than right-leaning culture in the US. And it's had some powerful victories that we haven't had, but it's also really far behind us in a lot of areas. But one of the leading cultural commentators there, who I really, as a person, I like a lot of her work, but I think she's really wrong at it in one area, is Louise Perry. And she argues that sexual violence and men being aggressive with women, that this stuff is all downstream of male pornography, and this is why we should restrict access to male pornography. And I'm like, excuse me, like, men did not make 50 Shades of Grey a bestseller. Like, women were, and then they'll say something like, oh, women just learned that they were supposed to get to this. No, 50 Shades of Grey was not like selling with like the women who are having the most sexual experience. It was mostly selling to like cat women and stuff like that, who like were the least influenced by male culture. I think being honest about female and male sexuality and not applying a idealized version of female and male sexuality is really important if we're ever going to win this particular battle. Because if you grow up telling a young girl, oh, we've done a lot of graphs on this on our show and stuff like this, where we show more women get turned on by being choked than not. And if you grow up and you tell them everybody who gets turned on by this is a deviant, and they don't know like the actual statistics, then they grow up self-identifying as a deviant. And when you self-identify as something, you begin looking for other ways to express that. If I grow up thinking like my sexual patterns or something like that are like super rare or something, when it's actually like a totally normal thing, I am going to be like, oh my God, like I'm this disgusting deviant, which can then normalize. I think that this is why in these families that are super restrictive around sexuality, you keep seeing these like child rape cases, or one kid ends up like molesting another kid or something like that. It's because they've already categorized themselves as a deviant over things that were otherwise normal. And so they see less of a barrier of doing like truly awful stuff. Where I think where we need to go is being like, you know, what turns you on doesn't matter. You didn't choose that. That's not part of who you are. What matters is what you choose to act on. Right? Like you can aim to live this wholesome lifestyle while still acknowledging that there's like this array of arousal patterns in humans. The other area where I used to be in your position around trans issues, and my perspective on trans issues has changed over time due to a few big realizations. The first is that I had bought into the lie that this existed in other cultures. And then I went into all of the specific instances where they said it existed in other cultures. And it was always one of two things. In cases like in India, it was young boys were being castrated so they could be used as sex workers. I'm like, that is not a trans, that's a cat or something, right? But then the cases, this is like Two-Spirit, this is some cases in East Asia. They're like, there's this individual who likes having sex with men, is effeminate, and has female jobs, like being like a bride, like a wedding planner.
Lady boys in Thailand or
that's
something?
That's a twink. That we know what that is. That's not a trans person. And then I tried to look into history. Has there ever been any documented phenomenon where people are so obsessed with wanting to identify as the other gender, they are willing to kill themselves? If this is not documented anywhere else in human history. So then I decided, okay, what else could be causing it? Because these people clearly believe that they have this. And I began to look into something called culture-bound illnesses. And you see these in like the penis stealing scares in Africa, where people think witches like steal their penises. And like we would hear that and be like, that is absurd. But then there's a show where Matt Walsh goes to Africa and he talks about trans people and they're like, that's absurd. Like that, they laugh. That's hilarious. And we have other culture-bound illnesses that are very similar to transness. The biggest and most studied culture-bound illness is probably anorexia. Anorexia typically doesn't exist until a culture learns that anorexia exists. And then what population does it disproportionately affect? It disproportionately affects autistic individuals, which is also what we see with the trans thing. It is also a form of body dysmorphia, very similar to transness. And if you have had a friend who was anorexic, like my wife was anorexic at one point, trying to convince them that like they're hurting themselves or this, it's very difficult to do. And it is very offensive to them. Like it's a very similar to conversations. And as soon as I had this, it all clicked for me. Oh, this is a like body dysmorphia based illnesses or culture bound illnesses, and we should be treating them probably in a different way. So I've moved in a different, maybe less mainstream accepted perspective on that, but I thought I'd share.
No, that's fair. Like I question those things too. I think that what it sounds like you're saying is that it's one of the reasons why it's difficult to get people to see that maybe this dysmorphic thing is not like it is a cultural contagion, like you say, or like a social contagion, as some people call it. It is difficult because I think it starts to they define themselves by it, and now you're attacking their identity. That's why when if you bring up criticisms of transgenderism as a concept, people say, oh, he's genociding us. That's why
but you're not like, and I think this is really important. The reason why sexuality became a form of identity was because we as a society removed the things that people used to identify with, which was their ancestry, which was their nation. There was a reporter at like a pronatalist event, and they go, I was okay with the pronatalist stuff, but I was really upset about all the religion and nationalism. And I was like, one, what's wrong with religion? And then two, what's wrong with nationalism? What's wrong with being proud of like your nation and your identity? Once you've removed that, people need to find a new thing to identify with. And the urban monoculture, the left, leaned into, if the core thing that matters in life is self-validation and arousal, then we're going to define your identity around these things. But these things this isn't an ethnic group. This would be like people saying you're trying to genocide like anorexic people because you're a doctor working on anorexia like relief.
Yeah.
That's an absurd idea.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm really glad you brought up the concept of your ancestry, because I've been talking about this as someone who talks about fathers' rights and the fatherlessness especially in the Black population and the issues with that. And one thing that I've been bringing up is that if you grow up without a father, then you actually can lose very quickly a concept of where you come from. So you don't know what it means to be a person with your last name, because there's nothing to attach it to. But now we're in a time, and this is like off the video games thing, but I think it's important too, because now we're living in a time where we have kids growing up who not only know their father, but their father didn't know their father, and that father may not have known his father. So you've lost maybe 3 of connection to your ancestry. And this is particularly interesting because people who are that separated from their own personal past are easier to put into a collective bucket with this ethnic group. So now you are no longer a Johnson or a Turner, you are Black, capital B Black. And now we can use you as a political tool. And this is something that I thought was really interesting too, was LeVar Burton. You guys know LeVar Burton from Reading Rainbow. And he was an actor on Star Trek: The Next Generation. I played Geordi LaForge. Anyway, LeVar Burton was or is a very pro-Black like activist type that was an actor. And he was on a PBS show where he got to look at his lineage. He got to learn about his heritage because they did a DNA test and found out. And what he learned was that he had a great, I think it was like a great grand uncle or something, that was a soldier that fought for the Confederacy. And it blew his mind because he was certain that he had no white people in his history, which is absurd because like everyone who's here probably has any number of people in their ancestry if they've lived here, especially if you're like a person whose ancestry goes back to the days of slavery or whatever, or the founding of the country. But when I saw that, and Angela Davis, who was like a very prominent communist activist from the 1970s, also learned that like she had ancestors that were on the Mayflower. So like we're talking like the original like settlers of America, and obviously not Black. So one of the things I thought was really interesting about that is that it makes a person a lot more vulnerable to become professional activists if they are completely divorced from their own ancestry, which is one of the reasons why I'm very much like on the pronatalist side of things, because I think that it really helps to know, not just obviously most people know who their mother is, but to know who your father is really crucial.
I think it's important, even touching on this topic, to talk about the complete destruction of American Black culture that has happened over the past half century. When you look at groups like Black Lives Matter and they are listing what they see as Black cultural values, they listed things like alternate family structures because they know from their community that with like 76% of Black kids are born without a dad in the picture. That is that high? It's like stupidly high.
It's like 80%.
Or 80%.
Last time I looked, yeah.
But if you look historically, and then what's so horrifying about this, if you go back to the 1960s in the United States, Black families actually had children born out of wedlock at half the rate of white families. It was 5% to 10%. So this is a completely modern and manufactured phenomenon. I don't think like anyone designed this. Again, I think that the urban monoculture and leftism evolves over time, and it found out essentially that the iterations of it that led to children being raised fatherless ended up having an easier time capturing those children in this new sort of pan-Black identity, which the left has tried to force on Latinos as well, and it had really blew up in their face because they were able to destroy Black culture enough to convince Black people like all Black people are basically the same thing in one culture. Now, actual Black people, you would know, even, for example, the recent like African immigrants, they don't really like the American Black culture at all. They see themselves as quite different. And so clearly it's not one culture, but the left needs it to see itself as one culture so that they can identify as this oppressed group. Yeah. And we point out one of the reasons why the left has basically lost the Latino vote is they didn't take the time to understand that Latinos don't identify as Latino. They identify as like Venezuelan or Cuban or Brazilian, and most of them don't really have positive stereotypes about the other Latino groups. And they attempted to force this identity on them, and they still had enough cultural cohesion to push back. Are they going to be able to continue to do this, or is their culture going to be destroyed, as we have seen with a lot of Black culture? And what this means for Black individuals today is that to rebuild their culture, they basically need to go back historically and reconstruct what a Black culture may look like within a modern context. But that's not like a horrible thing. Like my family has done that. We like structured a religion for our family. We made up holidays for our family, very similar to, and this isn't the first time in American history where Black people do this. Kwanzaa was a completely invented holiday where somebody was like, how can I structure a holiday to celebrate my vision of the American Black identity? So these are things that can be built on.
Yeah. So this is not insalvageable. This is not a done deal. I think that we're very resilient, much more resilient than we give ourselves credit for as a people. And I apply that to Blacks as well. Because I grew up in the west side of Chicago, like around Black and Latino in those kinds of communities. And I watched it fall apart. Like when I was very young, because I'm like 50, when I was very young, there was still like mostly intact families. And that just started to erode over time. But anyway, I
want to double click on something you're saying here, which has been a concept that I've been trying to highlight on my show. Is one of the things that the urban monoculture like really gets off on is this idea that you can't have cultural pride in an ancestry that you don't personally share. And so they'll do really odd things. Like I was accused of on X, they're like, oh, he must be like a white nationalist or like white supremacist because he gave his kid, like one of my kids has the name Octavian, which is a Roman name. And they're like classic sign of like white nationalism. And I was like, wait a second here, you nut jobs. Rome wasn't like a white place, like I'm clearly like British in ancestry. Like Rome conquered, colonized, and gave my ancestors the culture that I now take pride in. My ancestors, the very culture that I take the most pride in when I trace my ancestry back, a cultural ancestry back through Rome, through ancient Greece, then through Mesopotamia, through Egypt. These aren't people who look like me. You can take pride even in a culture that was colonized into your people. That is not like necessarily just an erasure. That can be an uplifting. I often talk on my show, if you look at ancient British culture, they would do child sacrifices. We know about the Wicker Man ceremony. We don't know much, but this was when they burned tons of humans alive in giant wicker statues, they were genuinely monstrous individuals. Like, it was not a culture to have pride in. And this is interesting that we have this concept I've talked about on my show, the diversity problem within white nationalism now. Like, white nationalism is just too diverse a community now, because it's not. What it is pride in the heritage of the Western tradition, which I think is something that many people can claim ownership of, and no one can claim true ownership of, except for maybe Italians. But like, Italian culture today kind of sucks. So I don't even know if they can claim ownership.
The mafia? No,
Yeah.
I joke. Yeah, no, and again, I think in general that is what is always being attacked. It's either through the family separating you from your ancestry, or it's something a little bit broader, low resolution, like your heritage, the history of where you come from. And Octavian is a super cool name, and they're just like jealous. But let me ask you this: because we've been talking a little bit about left and right, and I think that people that watch my show, and a lot, actually people in general, they might take issue with that or be sensitive to those terms. So I thought maybe we should define them. So what do you mean by, when you say you're on the right, what does that mean to you?
The New Right Coalition is a collection of groups predominantly fighting for cultural sovereignty and against the urban monoculture, which makes them very different than the Old Right. The Old Right used to be a Judeo-Christian cultural group fighting for cultural dominance, whereas today the right includes Orthodox Jews, it includes people like Elon, it includes even recent immigrants who don't want their children to fall prey to these crazy ideologies. Like, the left was all freaking out in this election cycle that Muslims went so far to the right. And it's because they do have a place in our coalition now, because what we are largely fighting for is every parent's right to raise their kids within their culture and have that culture perpetuate and thrive, and against the idea of shaming an individual for their cultural background. Now, if I talk about the urban monoculture, ironically, the core sin of the urban monoculture, of this leftist culture, is its sense of cultural imperialism. The idea that they'll say they respect different cultures. I point out to them, I'm like, yeah, but do you really? Look at African cultures, for example. You don't agree with their beliefs around gender norms. You don't believe with their structure of what a marriage is. You don't believe that they should parent their kids the way they do. Like, they use corporal punishment everywhere in Africa, right? And the left has freaked out on us for doing it. You don't really believe in their beliefs around sexual taboos should be normalized. And so if you don't believe that they should have the only cultural differences you're allowed to have is like a few token holidays and maybe dress a little different. You're not actually allowed to have a different culture. The goal of the urban monoculture ultimately is global cultural genocide and homogenization. And that's what makes it so monstrous and easy for a large number of people to collectively be like, hey, like, we're not for this imperialistic organization, and we want to dismantle the bureaucracies that it is using to extend its will, which is what you're seeing in organizations like Doge doing and stuff like that, and cut back the bloat and institutional elite classes that it has empowered. So that is how the modern right is defined for me.
Yeah, and the left, or the urban monoculture, as you put it, they're very locked in presentism. Everything is just now. There's no history. So there's just the right now. That's why
it's interesting that you say this, because they do it in psychotic ways. Like, when I point out and falling fertility rates and cultural diversity declining, and they're like, oh, you must just care about white people. I'm like, the lowest fertility rate group in the United States is Native Americans with a TFR of 1 or below 1. Do you not care that Native Americans are going to go extinct? This does mean, like, in the next 100 years, we are going to have as much cultural erasure of Native American cultures with a fertility rate this high as we would have had in the first 100 years after colonial contact. Like, it is going to be horrifying the amount of cultural diversity we're going to lose within that community. And I bring this up to them, and they're like, I care more about, like, making things pleasant for the Native Americans that are living now. And I'm like, wait, you actually have no care about the complete eradication of their culture? You have no care that this is what's going to happen if we don't do anything? And then they'll be like, you're not even bringing up how, like, people used to sterilize them. I'm like, look, that doesn't effing matter. Right now, this is happening to them, and you could be doing something to stop it, and you want to just deploy rhetorical arguments. I point out to them that if fertility collapse keeps going at the rate it's going at, Social Security is not going to be solvent anymore. Medicare is not going to be solvent anymore. And as such, welfare isn't going to be solvent anymore. And they're like, you're the ones cutting back these systems. How can you say you value them? It's like, we're cutting them back because we're trying to give them longer timelines to stay solvent. How do you not care that they will inevitably collapse if you do the math? And they fight for this in things like HAES, the Healthy at Every Size movement, where they say, oh, it's bad to tell a fat person that they are fat because that hurts their feelings. But obviously in the long term, like, this is bad for them. It's true with test scores, right? Like, you look at California, they're removing test scores because it's hurting people's feelings. Obviously it hurts them in the long run. That this is obviously going to increase inequality in the long run, or the handing out of fentanyl on street corners. You see this?
Yeah.
There is no
even get out clean needles so that they can shoot up but not get infected. Yeah, no, I know. And you have to ask yourself, I think that the only reason why they do it is not really because they are looking at the best potential outcomes for the groups they claim to care about, but they do it because it makes them feel like better people. So it's really just a self-serving, vainglory thing.
It's a completely aesthetic philosophy. It's like when Germany shut down its nuclear power plants and they had no alternative except for Russian oil. Like, they're literally just making their environment worse and the world's environment worse so that they can feel like good guys while doing something that's super expensive. And you even see this in how they frame the world. They will frame their beliefs in a way where they believe what, if true, would make the world more moral, but things that hurt people in reality. So, for example, they'll believe in blank slateism, that everyone is born with equal capacities, predilections, everything like that, and everything about us is picked up from our environment. Because if they admitted that some people are born more talented than other people, then they have to admit that the world is structurally unfair. They will believe that beauty is completely subjective, and even the fat woman is actually just as beautiful as anyone else.
She's a 10. Yeah, they're all 10s.
Yeah. It's only cultural and subjective reasons why you don't think that. And that would be more fair if true, but actually beauty is a sign of breedability, to be crass, and as measures, right? So it is a really bizarre philosophy that is completely disinterested in what is really true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it doesn't, and like I said, it doesn't really help anyone. In fact, it hurts people while convincing them that they're better people for it. It's delusional.
It doesn't hurt them a little bit. It hurts them a lot. The CDC poll done recently that showed 1 in 10 kids is attempting to kill themselves on any given year. Like, that is, if you knew that if you exposed your kid to something, if there's a 10% chance that they're going to try to kill themselves, you wouldn't expose them to that thing.
Yes.
And mental health rates are way lower on the left. Happiness rates are way lower on the left. You see, a great study we looked at recently showed if you're exposed to right-leaning online content, it doesn't hurt your mental health as much as being exposed to left-leaning online content, which significantly hurts your mental health. Like, it is really, the urban monoculture is really damaging to an individual psyche. There is no a positive that comes out of deciding you're going to live a life in the pursuit of, because this is what it tells people, live a life in the pursuit of validation, in the avoidance of things that are emotionally challenging, and in the pursuit of pleasure. Yeah. And this sounds pleasant, but downstream of it, it's the Cenobite.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I asked you I was asking about the right, or how you define it, this new, but you mentioned Elon Musk, and I wanted to throw some stuff at you that I think is really interesting. Elon Musk historically voted Democrat. Trump, historically Democrat. Tulsi Gabbard, historically Democrat. Tim Pool, historically Democrat. Joe Rogan, historically Democrat. So then we have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., right? So we have all of these former Democrats that are in this MAGA camp. And I think a lot of guys in tech, Mark Zuckerberg, I remember him like notoriously censorious on Facebook. And then he goes on Joe Rogan after the assassination attempt and completely has a revelation. Like, dude, that was the most badass thing I've ever seen. And I wonder and of course, all these people, I'm not necessarily lumping Mark Zuckerberg in with the others I mentioned, but I think that there is that's part of this shift that's happening. All these people historically were seen as or believe themselves to be on the left, but now they're part of this MAGA coalition. So does that mean that are they now on the right? Did they move, or did the
So
goalposts move, or did we just different? Are we
yeah,
contextualizing this differently now?
the thing that people get wrong when they're looking at how the right has changed and why a bunch of former Democrat voters are now on the right, and keep in mind, it's not just we can talk about all these tech bros, but if you look at Trump's top lieutenants, they weren't like Democrat like a while ago. Like they were Democrat the first time he ran. They were really like, we're talking about JD Vance, we're talking about Elon, we're talking about RFK, we're talking about his entire like lineup of. So the mistake that people make is they think that what this is the Overton window shifting from the left. They think that what happened is just what was normal shifted so far to the left that many former Democrats were left behind. And that is not what happened at all. A lot of people like myself and like Elon, our actual politics never really changed. It's that the parties in many ways became inverted in their purposes. If you go back to the 1990s, the Democrats were the party of let me live my life the way I want to live my life. Let's do what's like reasonable. Let's try to look at the actual science. Let's try to look at that was the Democratic Party. And they were fighting against an alternate group, which was the sort of Judeo-Christian group that was trying to impose its values on people through laws, through whether it was
censorship and that kind of thing.
Yeah, through gay marriage bans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This flipped when the urban monoculture became the dominant culture in America and began trying to enforce its value system on people through the legislative system, through the universities, through the school system. And now all of these people who were anti this sort of dictatorial and fascistic instincts, they now found themselves in the right-wing coalition, and the former parts of the right-wing coalition either left and went to the new Democratic coalition, your Dick Cheneys and stuff like that, or just found themselves being like, hey, like I work with the Heritage Foundation and stuff all the time. Hey, it makes sense for us to work together. Like there's like the avatar of this. So I think that's what happened there. It wasn't a shifting of Overton windows. That did happen to some extent. It was the people who, and this is what I talk about, like shifting to this greater Appalachian cultural group. This greater Appalachian cultural group didn't used to be a far right group. They were like half Democrat and half right leaning, but they all agreed on one thing, is that people shouldn't be telling them what to do. And that is the core of what rightism is today, the flag of like off my neck, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's more libertarian. It's more like in terms of.
This is the interesting thing. I think libertarianism is like a completely tarnished brand. I don't think, because for libertarians, they come to me and they're often surprised when I'm like, if communism worked, I would do it. Like the libertarian brand has become a worshiping of this way of doing things, and not a doing things in this way because it works best. And within the new right, we will take libertarian stances when it works best, but we will also do tariffs when that works, or raise the minimum wage when that works.
Yeah, it's libertarianism. I was interested in it for a while, but the truth about it is that it has the same problems that communism has. It's human nature. We can't live in a world where no one ever tariffs, because even if we like take it on principle not to do that, other countries will, and they have. So we have to operate within the world as it is. And just, so yeah, I'm with you on that. But I think it, to some degree, insofar as this desire for the state to leave their citizens alone as much as is reasonable, that's what I'm referring to. I don't think libertarianism is viable in practice, because it doesn't work, because there's too many human beings with free will that are doing what they want in the same way that communism or socialism doesn't work. Okay. So then
that's what I mean. It's not libertarian, it's cultural sovereignty. And I'd also point out that cultural sovereignty is very different than valuing individual sovereignty. So the problem with individual sovereignty is people spend a good chunk of their lives as kids. And kids don't make choices very well for them. And so if you believe in individual sovereignty as a core value, then you'll say something like, this kid thinks he's a woman, so now he's a woman. Or you may say something like, you shouldn't be able to circumcise someone because circumcision is not something a baby can consent to. And I'm like, now you've basically made it illegal to be a Jew in your country, because that's a very important commandment for them. So I think that a lot of people get it confused with the individualism of libertarianism instead of the cultural sovereigntyism that any Orthodox or conservative religious group inherently has as their core value. Like ultra Orthodox Jews have it as their core value, like the Amish have it as their core value. Educate your kids at home. That's why we built like a home education system for anybody who wants to use it called Parasia.io that does replaces the school system. Try to be just as good using like AI Socratic Tutor and like a tech tree for like video games you would have.
Oh, very cool.
You can also find it through collinsinstitute.com. Another place that we built something was Whizzling, spelled with a Z, .ai, which is like a toy that can talk to your kid and then we'll bring the conversation back to educational topics. We have the app version now and we're building out but I think with a lot of this stuff, one thing you need for cultural sovereignty to work is alternate systems of education outside of the state.
Yeah, it's definitely a very exciting time for that. So, okay, so I think we're a little over the hour. I know that for a little while there, your audio cut out, but I'll figure that out.
I can go a bit longer if you want. If there's any other questions
Okay.
you had that you want to go into.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to come back to the woke right thing for a second because I think that I'm very concerned about this kind of this kind of like grandstanding, this finger wagging. And I think that I'm glad that because I think that socially, okay, so let me explain a little bit what my belief is. I think of myself as far right in terms of what that means to me is, in my opinion, the difference between left and right as concepts has more to do with what the government's role is in people's lives. So the further left you go, the more you think the state is necessary, the more you're focused on things like policy. The further you go, the less you think it's necessary. Doesn't mean that it's not, but like you probably think there are some places we need defense, we need borders, we need police, we need firefighters, things like that. But maybe we don't need a giant welfare state. Maybe we don't need universal health care, whatever. Maybe we don't need, what is it? There was like the thing that Andrew Yang was pushing for was like universal basic income. And so like I see myself as saying, look, I think that people need to be able to govern themselves. I want to live in a society where men are restored to their rightful place as like heads of households, and then by extension communities where you have intact families. And I think that it builds out from there. And the more of that you have, the less you need of other things, all of these publicly funded institutions. And so but that's not the same as where my social limits are at, like how I feel about gay marriage or porn or adoption or IVF or whatever. I think those are almost separate things because those are all like, yeah, they're more social or their opinions on like other races or other cultures or whatever. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I see myself as somewhat like centrist in terms of my social beliefs. Like I don't care that gay people exist, and that's fine as long as it's like organic, because I do have concerns about people being groomed into things, and I wouldn't want that.
Yeah,
but
that's what I mean about cultural sovereignty, right? We are okay with people living the way they want to as long as cultural sovereignty wasn't violated.
Yeah.
And but I don't think this is like a centrist belief. I just think this is the core of what the right believes now. And I think that there's fringe individuals who want to enforce their culture on other people, but they don't have the institutional power to do that. And they are largely feel uncomfortable at right-leaning events. Like you can just watch like Nick Fuentes' coverage of the Republican conference leading up to the election, and he was just mortified by the level of diversity he saw there. And you can have diversity while all having pride in your own cultures. And that's, I think, where we're seeing the right headed right now. But I would say that one of the things you always have to worry about is that like status hierarchies emerge where individuals think, but that by signaling that they are more extreme on a particular issue or more pure on a particular issue, that they can one up another individual in status. But fortunately, as I said, the MAGA movement comes out of this greater Appalachian cultural tradition. And this tradition, the truck nuts conservative, has always had a very strong immune system against people doing that, because the moment somebody comes up to them and they're like, hey, what you guys are doing isn't proper here, they'll just give them the finger and belch. They do not care. They see you as invalidating your own authority by attempting to culturally pressure them into following your ideas of what proper behavior is. Like nothing could be lower status to this culture. So I think a lot of individuals who go out there an attempt to signal this. Matt Walsh would be a good example of this, being like, anime is bad, video games are bad. And we all just have a laugh at him. What are
Yeah.
you doing? You look like a boomer. You don't have say that stuff. Like, you have a right to say that stuff as long as you're not going to pass laws. And a lot of this comes not just out of the greater Appalachian culture tradition, but I also think out of the online roots of the new right,
Yeah.
which is 4chan culture, right? If somebody on 4chan is like, hey, you're not acting proper, if the person's going to then post whatever thing they thought they were acting improper about, but even more exaggerated just to piss them off. It's this like trolling culture. And I think that this is why trolling has become so central to this, because it's a way to subvert. Rather than kicking these people out, you just show them that trying to signal their status in this way is actually subversive of their status.
Yeah, yeah, and you bring up the Matt Walsh thing is a very good point, because one of the things, and it's ironic because the Daily Wire had been for a long time talking about the importance of essentially contributing to the culture, building in the culture to change things, but their attempts have not really gone over very well, and they make a terrible mistake by neglecting popular culture like anime and video games, in particular video games, because I think that where we're headed now, and I'm trying to bring it back to video game stuff because that's what the channel's sort of about, where we're at now is at a very important time, because with large AAA studios that were trying to back up the sort of what was thought to be the mainstream urban monoculture, let's say religion, they're failing, like all these games that failed because they tried to put the premises of the sort of racial activism, feminism, and all these other things, and they're not doing well. Meanwhile, smaller studios, AA studios with smaller teams that are a lot more agile, able to adapt, and they're doing very well. And what I think we're at there's a big change happening right now where Hollywood, which used to be essentially the end all be all of our entire culture, like they would define it, right? You can you mentioned Gladiator when we were talking, right? They are losing a lot of money and they're trying to like grasp at whatever they can to remain relevant. And I think that the future of our entertainment is going to be more interactive. Whereas if you watch a film or a TV show, you're a passive passenger, and video games are the next step of that, where you can actually contribute to the story. Now, this doesn't mean movies or TVs are going to go away, but I think that's what the entertainment industry is trying to do, and I think the video game industry is trying to do too, is turn video games into the new movies. So they have massive budgets. They're getting like actors that do voice work for these things are becoming presented as celebrities in their own right. They're creating celebrity culture around that and everything. And I think that there is going to be a big struggle to see where that industry goes, because you're going to have the people who obviously gamers want agency. That's the point of video games, to make choices, and those have impacts.
Yeah, you say, oh, I didn't know this was a video game channel, or I would have led with, I'm actually started a video game studio. People can check it out at rfab.ai, where what we're attempting to do is, because like I was looking at where we are as a gaming culture and everything like that, looking at what the left had done, and I'm watching all these big studios collapse. Yet, like, Wired writes this piece like the year that like the video gaming died for last year, and I was like, yeah, but sales were up year over year, which you just mean is that the big studios died, which means we have the biggest open market right now for developing cool new concepts that we've ever had in history, and it's cheaper than ever. Like, we're using AI to attempt to develop game worlds where like the game world is being built off of like a written language ledger, and your actions are translated into written language, which then interacts with that ledger, and then the world is drawn out of that. So an example of like the way we would do like combat in this is there's a central ledger of what is happening in the world, and then a Shadow of War AI translates from that central ledger what you can see, and then to LLMs that represent the other characters what they can see, and then you all propose what you're going to do next. And then a judge system determines, based on everyone's proposals, what actually ends up happening next without knowing who's the human. So it can't be overly nice. And so then it then draws the world from that. And I'm just really excited about the opportunities, because as this gets more advanced, we're going to be able to have like full 3D interactive graphics from this, and just create something that puts out more than you could ever have a studio put out. Like with this system, we're able to have AIs develop new game mechanics as you encounter new environments or opportunities or anything like that, or have new ideas, which I also love that, how much AI is going to completely transform the video gaming experience.
Yeah, and Elon was talking about that himself as well. I also saw Carl Sargon of Akkad. He was playing a Skyrim mod that essentially gave him like a giant friend that he could chat with that was run by AI. And I thought, and that was obviously like very like early stages, but I can see the potential. But this is what I'm saying. Like, I think we're at the precipice of something really amazing and revolutionary in gaming, which I think is going to be massive for our culture. And I believe that people on the right, at least some on the right at least, would be doing themselves a great disservice by not talking about this, by not like taking this seriously and instead just saying, oh, that's just for kids or whatever. I think, look, dude, this isn't Pac-Man anymore. This is like everybody games. This is a very mainstream thing. It's like saying TV is bad or books are bad or something.
Yeah, that is a great point. And what gaming means is going to transform with AI as well. So I am personally so excited to watch these studios finally dying and to watch an opportunity for new types of game worlds arise, while also seeing the explosion we've seen in indie studios putting out some just like absolutely banger titles after banger titles. So I'm excited about that as well. And I'm glad that I was able to be like, hey, by the way, we have a prototype that people can play for the RFAB AI project if you go like /play after rfab.ai, but it really sucks right now. It's like super early.
I do interviews with game developers when they show off their new game. So like when you feel like it's ready, let's take a look at it. I'll definitely show it off on my little corner of the internet. And because I'm all about promoting whoever's got something good cooking. And that sounds really cool.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so excited. I'm making it because I want to play it. I was like, I hate the AI chat things right now because they're so like narrative based. And I was like, why can't I play against an AI? Like, why can't I use an AI to create an experience that feels like I'm actually having to determine what I'm doing if somebody's shooting at me when I'm ducked behind something? Like right now in a game, it's like you pop up, you shoot, you then hide. You wouldn't do that in real life. That'd be an insane thing to do. But this allows you to, anyway. It's great to come on. People can always check out my show. It's a daily thing. It's fun.
All right. We'll definitely do that. And we'll wrap it up here. So thank you, Malcolm. I really appreciate you coming on. Hopefully you'd be willing to come on again. We can definitely talk about, what was that?
Sure. Just reach out to me in a couple months or whatever.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks so much for coming on the show. And to those of you guys who are watching, please share, subscribe, and comment, all that good stuff. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Long live Vivian.